Welcome to today's session with Photoshop CS6, and today we're going to cover 3D and placing 3D into a 2D scene. My name is Richard Curtis and I work for Adobe. I look after digital imaging in the UK. I'm going to open a new canvas, so File, New, New Canvas A4, and rotate this around so it's 90 degrees clockwise. The first thing I'm going to do is put some text on my plain background. So I'm going to choose the Type tool, use the Marquee tool in the Type tool, select an area I want to put the text in, and put the text. Now for this, I'm going to choose my initials, RC. Now, first thing I want to do is change the colour of those, and say I want to change that to be a lighter colour so you can see everything I'm doing. I'll change to a light turquoise colour. I can then convert this layer into a 3D layer by clicking the 3D icon at the top of the screen. Okay. Now that text is a little bit small and I want to make some modification to the actual text itself. I want to make the C a little bit smaller. So once I've committed, I can go back and modify the original source by clicking on the object, going to the properties and pressing edit source. Everything I'm doing in 3D is on the move tool. So the size of this text is a bit too small, so I can up that by highlighting the text, choosing the type, and then use the shift key and the arrow key upwards to increase the size of the text. I then want to take the original C and make that much smaller as well by reducing that to roughly about just over half the size. Great. And commit to that. Then as soon as I close this down and save that object, it will save it in the original PSD file and it will alter the 3D text. So our typical mnemonics, Adobe mnemonics, have a frame around these two letters. So to do that, I'm going to have to create a new layer and I'm going to have to create a rectangle. So I go to my layers panel and I'm going to go and select the rectangle tool. Now the rectangle tool will draw me a vector and it will automatically create me a new layer over and above the RC layer. So I'm going to hold my shift key down to make sure I get a perfect square, and I'm going to create a new layer by dragging out the rectangle. And you can see this rectangle is a blue rectangle. Now that's not going to be the right colour that I want to use later on. So I'm going to get the scene that I'm going to place these two objects into so you can see, so I'm going to pick the colour for this rectangle. So I'm just going to open Lightroom and here's my scene I want to use. So I'm going to put those objects as a 3D object into this scene and make it look quite natural. So I'm going to choose Edit in Photoshop CS6. So take it out of Lightroom, convert it and place it inside Photoshop. Okay. So go to my original image that I want to blend that 3D scene into. I have my eyedropper tool turned on and I want to choose a dark colour, something like that. So that will be copied into clipboard into my colour picker. So if I go back into my original scene, the rectangle, and double click on the rectangle itself, I can then go back into my foreground colour picker and pick up the colour that I want to use because it's already stored on the colour picker. Press OK and the rectangle is being converted to that colour. What I then like to do is to draw an inner rectangle to actually push the lettering through. So the lettering will sit inside this rectangle once I finish my 3D composition. So what I'm going to do is just use guides to make sure I have an equal frame. So I choose new guide and choose a horizontal one. I'm going to choose a few of these. Perfect. Then what I'm going to do, now I've got my border defined, is now go into my pen tool and draw an inner border just using a vector. So I'm going to hold down my Alt key and choose make sure my pen tool has been chosen and click, I'll zoom in first of all, and just click on the corner that I want it to start from and choose the second point and then I'll choose the third point and choose the last point, and you'll see there when I do this the actual frame is now displayed, so is my text. Now my text is slightly small, but that's okay, I'll fix that a little bit later on. But I've got my actual border of my rectangle pretty much defined now. So what I want to do now is convert this rectangle into a 3D rectangle by right clicking on that layer and saying new extrusion from 3D layer, on selected layer. So I want to make this layer, now that I've got it defined, into a 3D layer, and I can do that by choosing, I can right click on the rectangle layer and I can say new 3D extrusion from selected layer. That will convert that rectangle into a 3D object. Then I can move this around. Now obviously that's a bit too big, it's a square, but if I click on the object now with my move tool selected, I get my widget as I saw before. At this point I can change where it's sitting in the scene by moving it around, but if I push the V key I can then get to my extrusion level, and I can then change my extrusion of this object and make it much smaller. So I'm just going to drag down my extrusion to be much smaller. Okay. Now notice that these two objects aren't together yet, they're still on separate 3D planes, so I can still select the rectangle and the initials separately. I want to join them together to make sure we're on the same scene and the same plane. So I hold my command key down and choose both of these objects and then say filter, merge 3D layers, and this will merge these two together so they start interacting with each other. What I then need to do is just move them into position. So I'm going to grab the first object here by going back to my 3D layer and making sure that my RC layer is not selected and my rectangle is selected. So now you can see the tree structure of the actual scene that I've created. So I now need to move this one back by using the first widget. As I click on the actual cage, I use the move on Z axis and move this backwards. And if I move this back too far, you'll see it start to interact with the lettering. So actually I want to have it about there. If I then click on the text, that will be selected as part of the same scene, and I can move this around independently as well and have that on the scene. It's a bit small at the moment, so I'm going to change the size of that very quickly by going back to the source. So keeping it selected on the move tool, say edit source, and go in and change the size of this text. So okay, our text has now changed. I save that and bring that back into the original file by closing that down, and it automatically brings it through. So choose the move tool again and then just reposition these text inside this frame. About there is pretty good. Maybe it's a bit too high, and I can alter that y-axis very quickly by dragging it down. Now notice this also has shadows, so I can click on the object again, make sure it's selected using the widget and have the widget selected, and then I can go to the properties panel, and then I can say I'd like to catch shadows because I want to see the light coming through, but I want to get rid of the shadows, so I don't want to cast any shadows because that plane here is going to keep these shadows hidden. So cast shadows, no. And you can see the shadows go away straight away. Okay. Now I've got my bit of my scene working. I want to change the colours of this scene, and choose the eyedropper tool and select a really light colour, maybe orange, like that. That will be copied onto the clipboard. If I go back to my layer here, I can then choose this object using the move tool again, select the actual lettering, and then go over here. So look at the materials. Now the materials I can then change. So the materials for this is just a normal, just a default setting with a colour attached to it, but I may want to do something else. So I'm going to choose metal silver brushed. Now these come from, they're not there by default, they come from clicking on the cog and saying default for ray tracer. They will bring in the additional ones that you need. So I'm going to choose metal silver brushed, and you'll see the texture will change on this lettering to be the same as that material. What I can then do is change the colour, so go to diffuse colour and click on the eyedropper tool, and that changes the colours here. At which point then I may want to change more information about the lettering, so I can then go back to my move tool, select the text, get the widget text, and then press the V key, and the V key will take me, press the V key twice, will take me to the inflation and the bevel width. At this point in time I can change the inflation angle, and I can change the amount of inflation on this object by pushing the inflation up and down. You'll see it starts to add some shape to this 3D object. It's going about there. I could also change the bevel as well. I could change the bevel angle off, and I'm just going to increase the bevel width to show you there. Then you can see the bevel is coming through, but I don't want that on so much now. I want to take that off and have that just as a flat bevel. So you can see that I can pretty easily change this. So this is looking a pretty nice kind of lettering inside this 2D scene. Now I want to make sure that the background of this is all nice as well, so I select the background just using the move tool again, and you can see the diffuse is set to grey. Now let's set it to something else. So I'm going to select the eyedropper tool, let's check to something else. Before I select the actual colour, let's go find a colour from the scene where we're going to put it, and choose my eyedropper tool, and maybe choose one of these greens over here, something like nice and like that, so nice and bright. Go back to my scene, and then go back to my diffuse layer, and then click on the foreground colour, and it will change then the background colour of the frame. Now this frame may need some dimension. Just select it, and I'm going to choose VT twice and change the bevel. So just change the bevel slightly to give me a little bit more dimension. I'm going to look at the lights as well. So if I click on the lights icon at the top, I can then change the lights and move this around to get really nice kind of lighting into my scene. That's pretty nice. I'm going to keep it there. I need to change it later on anyway, because I'll need to put it into the scene when I blend it. Okay, so if I just render this quickly, I want to see just a quick final preview of what it looks like. I'm going to highlight the whole area with the marquee tool, and then on the properties panel is just choose the render option, making sure that my 3D scene is selected. Now the render is complete, you can see we have a slight issue. We have this dark line going through the scene here. The plane goes straight through the object we're building. We need to be above the plane, so we need to move this scene out of the way slightly. So back to my 3D object and select both my objects, and this time I'm going to move them up on the y-axis to get them out of that 3D plane. You can see there it lifts out of the 3D plane. I lift it quite high so it's out there for a second, and then choose 3D snap object to ground plane. It will then put it back to where it needs to be. Okay, that's brilliant. Now we obviously can't see this, so I need to replace the ground plane. The scene is a bit too small, the object's a bit too big, so I need to reset the size of the canvas. So to do that, I'm just going to choose the crop tool and crop upwards. I'm able to bring back more canvas, and it will then automatically relay the 3D object back into that canvas. So now I can see exactly what I'm working with. Now I need to put this back to where it was. Okay, so you can see where it's interacting. So I'm just going to pull this apart and move it back into position. So this is all pretty easy stuff. Now it's a little bit skewed, so I want to just make sure that's correct. So I can change the camera to show me from the top what's happening to my 3D perspective. What it means is I can actually get everything lined up by using the top level camera. So if I choose this back plane, I'm able to then rotate this back plane and put it into position and get it square. So I just move it around like this to get all rid of the edges, and then rotate using the y-axis, rotate this and square this around, square this off so it matches. And you can see that now it's perfectly square. So I'm going to put that back, and you can see there now that's actually fitting much better. Just check the other elevations. Okay, I can reposition this based upon those elevations. I can just select and move this around so I can put it exactly where it needs to be using these other cameras, which is really handy. So if I change my environment pane, I can then move this around. You can see how it's moving now. So we go back to the 2D scene we used before. We make sure it's all selected by using select all, and we drag the scene to the 3D scene where we want it. So we're going to go to Layers palette and just move this around using the Move tool, and just put it into perspective where we want it. We want it about there. So it's in the wrong place at the moment. We need to put it below the 3D layer and drop it below. So just move that around, and you can see there this is going to fit quite nicely into this scene. So I'm going to choose this 3D layer, and the first thing I need to do is tell Photoshop how to put it into this scene. The most important point of 3D in the 2D scene is to choose a vanishing point. So on the widget at the bottom of the screen on the left, I can right click and I can say vanishing point grid. Photoshop will say to me, well, we don't have a vanishing point grid, do you want to make one? So then it will take me to the vanishing point mode and ask me to build a vanishing point grid for this scene. I'm going to guess that it's about here. Now I'm going to expand the grid by opening the grid out and giving it more of a perspective. I press OK. What happens is Photoshop will now put the 3D object onto the vanishing point, and you can see it's done a pretty good job by moving it around. If I now go to my 3D scene, we now put this into perspective of the 2D scene. We need to just select the image, so I'm selecting both my layers again. What I can then do is grab the cage and move it into the scene. I can move it about there. My mnemonic and the shadow. So to move my shadow around, I can grab the infinite light, grab the shadow around, and make sure it falls into place where it needs to be. Now the shadows are falling this way, so I can use my shift key and my cursor turns into a plus, and that means I can then drag this around to where my shadows need to be. I can also change the shadow softness as well by dragging the shadow softness down, so maybe about there. We now have this object based on a 2D scene. Now it's not altogether seamless yet, so we need to zoom in and make it a bit more seamless. So what I'm going to do is go back to my layer, and I'm going to put a mask on this object. So choose a mask, and then choose my paintbrush tool. And then one of the things we've done in CS6 is change the heads-up display. So if I push the Alt and the Control key at the same time, using the, in this case, the Wacom tablet, I can change the diameter of the brush and the hardness and softness of the brush by moving this up vertically. So I want a nice soft brush, but quite small. And then what I can do is paint with black. So I've got my brush selected using B, and over here my foreground colour is white. Now everything white will show through, and it's all white currently, so I need to mask it off and paint with black and hide it. So the X key does that, or I can choose a little arrow here and that will do that as well. Chosen the black is then use my tablet to paint in the effect. Maybe I need to change the brush size, to push the hardness, to make it a bit harder, and really blend this in. It may go too far, so I just need to change the size and get really small. Again, paint with white this time, so I'm going to undo this change. Press the X key again, make sure it's white in the foreground, and then paint in realism back into this scene. Then alternate my brushes, my selection, alternate my softness and my sharpness to give me a nice effect. This is a little bit kind of raised there so it fits in. Make sure my shadows are there as well. I can burn some shadows out if I want to burn some shadows out. It fits in quite nice into the scene. Now, the last thing we need to do is to render the scene. So I choose my marquee tool. I'm going to choose the whole 3D object as the marquee tool. Make sure it's selected in the layer palette. Render button on the properties. It will now go render me the scene. So the render's doing pretty well. It's almost finished, so I'm just going to finish it there. And then I need to finish off the scene. Now you see there's a white patch at the top and the bottom. I need to get rid of that by using the crop tool and just crop that out, remove those white areas, and then press go. And there you have a fully blended with a 3D object blended into a 2D scene.